Action.
We are back in session. We got one quick item we need to take care of right quick. Mr. Price, I think you got one plot that we need to act on pretty quick.
Yes, sir. We've got Glen Laurel Section 8 final. This is actually just a one-lot subdivision because it involves the extension of Glen Laurel Drive is the reason that you're seeing it. It's the numbered lot is 107, but it's in the same subdivision as the rest of Glen Laurel. Planning Board has reviewed the subdivision and recommends it be approved as presented.
Mr. Chairman.
Motion to approve.
I have a motion on the floor. Any discussion? No discussion. All in favor of approval of the plot, raise your right hand. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Tom.
Mr. Price, I appreciate that expedited work there.
I won't tell them where you at, Connie.
Mr. Chairman.
I hear you.
We were about an hour and a half behind schedule. We have our work session with Davenport and Company presentation on schools capital improvement plan. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being patient.
Absolutely, not a problem. While the presentation's getting pulled up, I'm Ted Cole with Davenport, and my colleague Mitch Bergoglio is here today with me. As well, we've got the county's bond attorney, Tom Lee, with Womble Carlisle in Raleigh. Big picture, what we want to discuss with you all today, first, there's two booklets. The smaller one that's got a title that says Discussion Materials Middle School Projects is just that. It's specific to two potential new middle schools, and we're going to talk through some issues related to those schools. The second presentation is more comprehensive. It is not only about school capital projects, but the entire county's capital program over the next 10 years or so. And that's a follow-on to a presentation that we had made to the county and school boards back in October, I believe it was. But as it relates to the middle school presentation here, there are essentially three key issues as we see it that hopefully we can provide you all some perspective on as you decide how you want to move forward. And I think question one, or issue number one, is do you want to do these schools? And again, what we're talking about here is a new middle school that's being called, just find that here.
Grantham.
Yeah, Grantham School and the Spring Creek School. So question one is, do we want to move forward with these projects? Question two, and this pulls in some discussions that have been had between the schools, the county, the schools consultant, the architects. Do you want to build what they're calling a high-performance school? Highly energy efficient, LEED certified, things of that nature. Their term is a high-performance school. Solar panels that will provide enough energy to run the school, if you will, from an electric perspective. The idea being that you produce all the electricity that you need and you don't have to pay an electric bill for the life of the facility. So high-performance school versus what I'll call maybe a more traditional school. Probably much like what you have in place today, more traditional systems. And then I think the third question is, how do you want to bring these schools online as it relates to procurement and ownership and debt service versus leases? Do you want to do a privatized lease approach? Do you want to do a traditional procurement approach? Would be you design it, you bid it out, contractors bid on it, and you award the contract and you build it. You own it, you operate it. Or somewhere in the middle there, do you want to consider a design build program, for instance? So those are the three big questions as we see it that you all need to tackle as you move forward. And much of what's in this middle school booklet is, well, see if I can move this forward. Get you guys to go to page 2. There's page numbers in the lower right corner. Page 2, which says preliminary project budget comparison. We've got 3 scenarios here, and this is information that was provided by the project architects, First Floor Incorporated. The first is sort of on the left there. You'll see it's a high-performance school with a privatized project delivery. That is, you have a developer who's bringing this school online. They build it, they own it for some period of time, and they lease it to the county or to the school board. And you'll see that that base cost for that school is estimated by them at $42.1 million. And then as you go down the line, you'll see that they have added some additional cost categories: technology allowance of $2.8 million, furniture, fixture, and equipment 3.3, a contingency of 2.7, and an item called soft costs at 5.8, which is detailed down below, for a total project cost of $56.8 million. Part of this privatized delivery is that a private entity would build and own this facility for some period of time, and as a result would be eligible to take advantage of certain tax credits. It wouldn't be owned by the counties or the schools, it would be owned by this developer. And what they're saying is that there could be, or would be, $2 million of tax credits that would be able to reduce the upfront cost of this facility. So it takes it down to $54.8 million. The middle column is that same high-performance school. So it has all the high-performance attributes as option 1. And then when you go down, you'll see it has the same technology allowance, $2.8 million, the same FF&E allowance of $3.3 million. The contingency is slightly higher, $3.6 million. The reason being is this would be built under a more traditional delivery method. It wouldn't be built by a private entity and owned by a private entity. It would be this high-performance school that is designed and bid out by the county, and the county builds it, owns it, and operates it with the schools. So they have a slightly higher contingency built into that option, the same soft cost by and large. Total subtotal of the project cost is $57.7 million. And then what you'll see is there's an inflation adjustment equal to 10%. That is a number that came from the project architect, $5.7 million, bringing the total cost of this option to $63.5 million. The idea here is under the traditional delivery method. Again, according to the project architects, it takes more time to bring this project online, to get it to where you're bidding it out in the construction market. And in their opinion, you will be exposing yourselves to inflation, and they have provided us the 10% adjustment for the extra time required to get this designed and bid compared to the first option. So that's what brings that total cost up to $63.5 million. The third option is a non-high performance school, so it doesn't have all of the energy savings and the systems that are in the first 2 projects, and it's also done under a traditional delivery method. So we start with the same cost of $42 million, but essentially what we're doing here is we're backing out the additional costs associated with a high performance school. So you back out $3.6 million for solar. Again, this is not a high performance option. You back out the extended warranties, the geothermal wells, certain HVAC equipment upgrades, LED lighting, others. You'll see technology allowance is the same at $2.8 million, FF&E the same at $3.3 million, contingency at $3.6, and soft costs are slightly reduced from the other cases at $4.8. So here you've got a $51.3 million project cost. And again, as per the project architects, because this is a traditional project delivery, the additional time that they've estimated that it would take to get this to bid would take approximately a year. with a 10% inflation adjustment, it's another $5 million in their estimates of additional project costs, so it takes you to $56.4 million. So those are the three cases that we have looked at, that we've been working on, and as I've alluded to, a number of these assumptions in here on the project costs and the time that it takes to bid the project and the inflation is driven by the inputs from the architects. So there may be other approaches that you want to take to addressing inflation for the next year, but we've tried to present this in a way that's consistent with the numbers that they've provided as we've worked through this. Okay? Any questions at this point?
Mr. Chairman. Mayor, I have one. Am I reading this correctly on the page 2 that the high performance privatized project, which I would call a green school, is that right?
Both those first two, I think, would both qualify as the green school. They're both high performance. One is brought on by a private entity, a public-private approach, and the middle one is where you would build that same green school, but you would do it under a more traditional approach without the private entity.
Okay, so so the traditional cost to build a traditional school, non-high performance, is more than the high performance privatized school. $2 million more.
Correct. And what the major driver, that according to their numbers, yes, sir. The major driver in their assumption is that because you're not building this school under a privatized approach, their contention is the privatized approach can move very quickly, and you can lock in your costs now as opposed to a traditional approach, which is where you design it and then you bid it. And what they're saying is that additional time for the traditional delivery exposes the county to inflation, and they've estimated on these projects that's about $5 million of additional costs. Now that is certainly a point that folks can have a different opinion on, but again, we've been asked to sort of work with them and include their numbers in here.
Okay, follow up. What about, does this take into consideration if you build either school, green school or traditional design build, or is this going through the regular bid process, which can be cumbersome and long?
Anything that we're showing in here in the parentheses that says traditional project delivery would be the approach where you would design the school, which would take some period of time, with an architect. The architect would design it with you all, and then it's bid when that design is complete. And that can take any number of months depending on really the design schedule and is it, exactly how the architect proposes to work that time schedule. The privatized approach, what they say is it can move more quickly. You can lock in your prices today, and but it's not completely designed up front when you lock that price in. But they work that as the project unfolds. They're designing it and building it, on more of a parallel track.
Okay, thank you.
You have a question, Mr.
I didn't, Mr. Go ahead.
You opened up a whole bunch of comments on my part, and I'll try to contain them. But the first thing is some words that you used there, and that was their numbers, their estimates, and their assumptions.
Referencing the project architects, yes, sir.
These are not your numbers, they are their numbers, and as you are well aware, you can take any numbers and justify an outcome or direct an outcome. With that said, it's very clear that they increased the contingency on a high-performance project delivery by $900,000. In other words, a 10% inflation rate of $5.7 million. These are kind of tilting the windmill a little bit, in my estimation. And I also want to make sure that we are not talking about a traditional school as such. This is based upon their design and their architect and their construction. Am I correct?
100%, yes, sir. It's their design, their architect, their concept.
So, in that we have already seen an alternative plan that was a traditional school that did not have an auditorium. Please note, these include auditoriums. That was a traditionally built school that had estimates in the neighborhood of less than $15 million for each one of these schools. Kind of raises the question in my mind, if we can build 2 schools for $30 million, why are we looking at figures of $56 million?
Understood. And again, as part of the direction that we've received was to work with the architect and take their numbers. And when we get into the area of project costs and contingencies, that's really beyond our area of expertise. So we rely on them to provide us with those numbers. That's what we've used here. But as I said, I think you can certainly look at these charts and determine where you have a level of comfort and where you don't with the assumptions.
So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. These are numbers coming from their architect, their suggestions, their designs as such, with a solar green construction or traditional. We're not comparing any other type of plan or any other type of construction.
No, sir. These concepts and estimates came from its source there, First Floor, which was the firm that had been interfacing with the school board, and that's 100% here is their concepts and their estimates.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
So let's move to page 3, and what we're doing here now. Yes, sir.
Before we move on, and I realize I've seen these figures before, but have you had any other contact, and maybe that's not part of your, with the school system, to see if their latest numbers reflected what they designed was like this?
I have not had any confirmation from the schools that these project costs or these concepts are consistent with what they've said they need or want. I have not had that conversation.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Bell?
just in case if we're being broadcast and the school board might be listening, I want everybody to keep in mind that we're not talking about what kind of schools they're going to build. We're looking at finances. Am I correct?
We've got, on page 2 here, we really do have 2 key concepts. It's the concept of high performance, to use the architect's term, a high performance school versus a non-high performance school. And my understanding there, the difference is with a high performance school, you have things like solar, extended warranties on certain systems, geothermal wells. I think you have upgraded HVAC equipment, so let's call it more efficient HVAC equipment, LED lighting. You have this platinum certification and this energy dashboard. So their high-performance school has all of those attributes, whereas the non-high-performance school just doesn't have those things.
Yes, I understand.
So that's one issue. And then the second issue that's being addressed on page 2 is a privatized project delivery. So you say, yes, we want to build this building. And the privatized approach is where you enter into an agreement, and Tom can correct me or Borden if I misspeak, but you enter into agreement essentially with a private entity, a developer, and they build this project and they lease it to the county/schools to use it. Whereas the other approach is what I've called here, or they've called a traditional project delivery, where that private entity is not involved. You would design what you want, county/schools design what you want with an architect, you bid it out, you build it, you own it, you operate it.
Yes.
So we've got what the product is, high performance versus non-high performance, and 2, how do you bring it online, privatized versus traditional.
Yes, that's the major point that I was trying to make. I just didn't want the schools to think that we are trying to tell them what type schools to build.
Point well taken, and this, again, this is from the architects, and I gather it has some bearing on conversations that they've had with the school folks about the merits of a high-performance school versus a more traditional design. Okay? So those are the project costs, and then we go on page 3, and we, again, working with the architects and their consultants, we are addressing here and giving you an overview of the financing options. So let's assume we understand and we accept the project cost differences that we just talked through. We then went and worked with them. They provided us with estimated, what I'll call debt service schedules. And this dates back a little bit. It dates back to November. But what I can tell you is the estimates that they've done for the financing, we're generally in agreement with. We feel like it was reflective of the market. The reality is interest rates have come down a bit since November, so these numbers might look better today than they did then. But on a comparative basis, when they were looking at the different ways to finance this project, we were in general agreement that they were making good assumptions as it relates to interest rates and the bond market. Couple of points to note here, and you'll see on the right-hand side, you'll see the annual payments. Under that first column, it says high performance privatized project delivery. Remember, that's the school with the solar and energy efficient systems, if you will. You have a project developer, a private developer who is leasing this facility to you, and you can see that the payments there based on that project cost is about $4.4 million a year. So there will be debt issued. It really all traces back to the county because ultimately it's the county's commitment to occupy this school and pay lease payments to the developer that is the basis of the credit. So while it may not be technically debt service that you're paying them, it is a lease payment that in this case goes out 20 years on a level basis, $4.4, almost $4.5 million a year. Now remember, that project, from the prior page, that project was about $54.8 million. The second column is that same high-performance school, but it's where you go out and actually finance it yourselves, you design it and build it. You can see the debt service is about $5.2 million a year for 20 years. Remember, that's the project, according to the architects, that cost about $63.5 million. The big difference there is because it takes an extra year to design it, and their contention is that you have inflation costs over that period of time. So you have $5.2 million a year in debt service. And then the third is that non-high performance school through traditional delivery. It's about a $56 million school, or two schools rather, at $4.6, $4.7 million a year. So this is our attempt to show you not what the project costs are, because we've covered that, but assuming those project costs that we have been given, what is the annual payment, whether it's a debt service payment or a lease to a private entity. And that's the comparison on page 3, so you can see what the annual outlay would be for the county/schools under these 3 different approaches. Okay?
Question, excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Right.
Line 23 down there, what's that MPV to? What is that?
It's the present value of those future cash flows. So if you look at that first column, it's $4.4 million a year, and if you add all of that up, it's $89.5 million over 20 years. In today's dollar, if you discount those cash flows back, it's $56.5 million.
Gotcha.
And we discount it back using the borrowing rate. So it's just a present value of those future payments.
Mr. Doherty. And on line 8 and 9, what is TIC and AIC?
That is basically the interest rate of the borrowing. True interest cost is the TIC. All-in interest cost is the AIC. So what you'll see there is we've got that first option, the estimate back in November, and again, we were comfortable with these estimates from the developer, was a 4.85%. The estimate under the middle case was 5.08%. Now, you raise a good question. Why is that one higher? Remember that traditional project delivery takes about a year to get to where you would bid the project and secure the financing. If you said design this, then bid it, and we'll issue the debt at that point in time, the assumption has been that that takes an additional year compared to the first option. And what we've built into these numbers to try to reflect that additional year, we could see interest rates go up. We've built in an additional 1% from the current market. So it's another assumption that says if you wait longer to do the financing, i.e. if you don't enter into that privatized approach today, it's going to take longer to do the project, take longer to put the financing in place, and you are potentially exposed to an interest rate increase.
Just to follow up. Yes, sir. Would you mitigate that by a design build?
I believe you would, and I would need a little bit of help from the attorneys perhaps, but design build is not what we're using here when we talk about traditional project delivery. So I would say that may be an approach to bring the project online that maybe splits the difference between these two, or it may even err closer to the side of the privatized approach. Okay? So again, we're back to the discussion of not necessarily which high performance versus non-high performance, but the approach to bringing the project online. Is it privatized? The contention there is it can happen today or very quickly. You lock in your project costs and you lock in your financing costs, whereas under a more traditional approach, it takes a little bit longer to get to where you're ready to finance the project, and the assumption is that costs would potentially go up, as would interest rates. That could be mitigated by a design build approach. Okay? One of the other...
Can I ask one question?
Please.
Yes, sir. Do you know why, if they say that they would be ready to do the high performance and get that moving immediately, why they're saying it's another year if they have to design it? Don't they have to have it designed already?
That's a good question. You know, I don't know exactly how they would propose to have the efficiency of time under the privatized approach versus the traditional, but presumably it's designed to some extent, or they can get started and lock in prices as design is unfolding. But a good question. Page 4, another part of the discussion thus far on these schools has been within the concept of high performance. One of the things we talked about is the solar, the high efficiency systems, HVAC systems, and part of what the project architects have provided us here on page 4 is under the high performance approach, what they have contended is that school, that high performance school or schools, would create enough electricity from the solar to essentially provide all the electricity that the facility needs. So it would generate and use its own electricity. Point being, there would be no electric bill for these schools, for these high performance schools. Between the solar and the very efficient systems, there wouldn't be an out-of-pocket electric bill required for the school. And so what we've shown you under those two high-performance cases is that your annual payment, whether it's a lease payment or a debt service payment, that would really constitute the annual expense for operating the school. There wouldn't be an annual or monthly electric bill. What they've shown us on the far right-hand side is their estimates of what the electric cost would be to run these same schools, but non-high performance. So you don't build that high performance school. No solar, call it more standard systems. What they're showing us on that far right column is their estimates of what the annual electric cost would be for those facilities. They've carried that out over a 40-year term, which would coincide, let's say, with the expected useful life of the facility. And what they're saying, we've got it footnoted there, some of their assumptions about what the cost of electricity would be and the growth factor. So you can see over that 40-year term what the potential energy cost would be of a non-high performance school, and essentially what the savings would be if you built a high performance school.
You trust those figures?
You'll see it here in a moment. Actually, we put it in a bullet point. It says additional analysis of the energy savings may be required to more fully understand the potential impacts.
I see you put it in
I don't
plain
understand them necessarily at this point. There's a lot that goes into that, not only in terms of how much electricity does a school use in any given year, but what assumptions you would make about how much electricity it would use in the future and what the cost of electricity will be in the future.
So these are not your figures. These are figures coming from the architect that's trying to get this job.
First Floor Inc. provided all of these
Okay, thank you
figures.
very
Yes,
much.
sir.
And these electrical figures are just for the facility. They do not take into account any lighting, field lighting.
So again, and this was something that we had, consulted with the architects about. Their numbers on what the project costs would be, their estimates of the electric savings from the high performance school. On page 5, we've tried to give you just sort of big picture, some considerations. The first being high performance versus non-high performance. We've already established and discussed that the high performance building the difference in cost is about $6.5 million. But that additional cost of the high performance school would be offset, reduced, or by an eliminated energy cost. Again, additional analysis, I think, will be required for you all, the school board, whomever, to get to a level of comfort that that high-performance school can indeed create enough electricity to satisfy its own needs. Very good concept. I just don't, that's not our area of expertise to be able to provide you definitive guidance on whether that's achievable or not. So I think that's an open item that needs to be reviewed if you decide to go that route. The second bullet point talks about taxable lease financing. That's that privatized approach where you have the developer. A county for this type of project would normally borrow on a tax-exempt basis. But if you go that privatized approach, because you have a for-profit developer who is building, owning this school and leasing it to you, that financing would need to be taxable. That's just tax law that would drive that decision. And when we were looking at these numbers back in November, again, it's a little bit dated, but the relationship is consistent. Taxable financing at that time was about 4.85% for something like this, tax exempt 4.05. So the privatized approach requires a taxable financing, which is at a higher interest rate than what you could do on your own, in your own name, on a tax exempt basis. Now remember, part of the approach has been you can do that taxable privatized approach today and lock in those rates today, whereas the more traditional approach would take a year and interest rates could move up. So you're back to that question of how quickly could you move either under a privatized approach or a more traditional approach to not only lock in your project costs, but also your cost of capital, your borrowing rate.
Mr. Doherty.
I'm glad that I'm asking questions. we've got I think our experts here. In today's market, if the county were borrowing money, and I'm going back with a conversation that I had with our county manager, and I remember stated to me that if we didn't go with a bond, if we just did a traditional type of financing, certificates of participation, what would be the current rate under a certificate of participation type of borrowing?
Sure. It would be presumably tax exempt, because you're a county borrowing for a school. Let's just assume that would be tax exempt, which would be the case most every time. Today you would be borrowing under 4% in my estimation. You would have the bond ratings equivalent with Wayne County's credit, so you're talking a AA credit, probably a 20-year term. I think you could very comfortably assume that you'd be at or just under 4%.
At or just under?
Yes.
If you went under a bond, would that significantly lower that interest rate?
So a voted GO
bond.
bond as opposed to an installment financing. So that the 4% rate would be an installment financing. It wouldn't be a GO bond. If you voted and issued GO bonds, you'll have a better rate than you would on the installment. It might be the difference between, a 3.75 and 4%.
Well, and
that's 1/4%, let's say.
That's what the manager told me, and it's basically 1/4%.
And I will just for perspective, that is a relationship that moves, so it's just an estimate, but I think that would be my.
But if we were borrowing today, certificates of participation, we could get it at basically 4% or less, a little less maybe. Mm-hmm. But if we went with a bond, which would take some time.
Correct.
Then you could save 1/4% maybe.
I think that's a good estimate, yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So you've got the difference in the interest rates between going public or more traditional tax exempt versus taxable. Now, I will tell you, back when we looked at the payment stream here on page 3, we accounted for the differences in the interest rate. So that's not a new concept here. But I wanted to point it out here on page 5. Again, we've talked about the timing considerations. How quickly, once you decide you want to do something, how quickly can you move to either design it or lock in your costs, lock in your financing? And that's going to be driven largely by how you choose to procure these schools. Do you want to do a private approach? Do you want to do a very traditional design, bid, build approach, or perhaps something in between? The final point I would mention here on page 5 is the potential availability of renewable energy tax credits. This high-performance school with the solar system, solar panels, I should say, according to the architect, would be eligible for some tax credits because you have a private entity that owns and operates the school. That private entity can take advantage of tax credits that the county or the school wouldn't be able to. And if you remember back in the project cost, we showed you a $2 million credit, if you will. That is the tax credit that the architects have identified as being available to reduce the project cost. Okay?
Another question.
Yes, sir.
Would a private entity have to pay property tax?
It's a great question. We talked a little bit about this before the meeting.
Yes, it would, wouldn't it? And that is not reflected in here, is it?
No, sir. The lease payment, as I'm calling it, in that private approach is just strictly debt service. If there are taxes that the private entity has to pay on the facility, we've not reflected that. That wasn't part of there.
But it was interesting that they added the insurance, the cost of insurance of $750,000, but did not add the cost of taxes.
Makes your cost of issuance.
Oh, issuance.
That's just the
Start
cost,
looking
yes,
at
that's all right, that's just the
Cost
cost
of issuance. So
to issue the debt.
So insurance is not.
Insurance is not in here as far as we know in those cash flows. So taxes, if applicable, insurance.
I know.
A few other items that I think are relevant here on page 6, and we're nearing the end here. And these are really questions, some of which have been answered by the architects, some of which haven't. But, and there may well be other questions you have, but the first one is, is the county exposed to any construction risk, developer risk, or other counterparty risk under the privatized project delivery method that they would not experience under a traditional project delivery? The architects have provided some perspective on these questions in the back of the book, so I would encourage you to look at some of the email traffic back and forth. And essentially what they say is no, in fact, there's a reduction in risk from a traditional project delivered project. The school or county's only risk is the interest payments during construction. So, you know, it's a complicated question. I think it could be answered on a number of different levels, but it is a more complex way to deliver a project than a traditional approach. That doesn't mean it's not a good idea, but I think the question stands is what additional risks might the county be exposed to under a privatized approach as compared to a more traditional approach? And part of that is the second bullet point. It says, how would the quote-unquote unwind, and I'll explain that in a moment, of the lease transaction occur? Are there any risks to the county? So in that first approach, that privatized approach where you have the developer, they build the school and you lease it from them, our understanding is that they will, the operating lease will be a long-term operating lease, meaning, you know, the payments go out 20 years, but the private entity is said to have an economic incentive to unwind this deal, get out of the deal in some period of time, let's say it's 7 years, because the tax benefits to that developer go away. And the question becomes, because you're going to want to use this for the long term, how do you unwind that lease with the private entity? And it is a fairly complex concept. The debt is out. They issued debt to do this over 20 years. The lease technically goes out, I think, 20 years or longer. But the private entity is said to have an economic incentive to try to unwind this transaction or remove himself from the ownership of this facility after some period of time, let's say 7 years. And the mechanics of how that unwind occurs is a point of discussion, I think, that needs to really be addressed, not necessarily at today's meeting, but it is a very significant part of this proposed approach that everybody needs to be comfortable with.
Question, Mr. Chairman. On the other schools, I assume there's probably a lot of schools out there in North Carolina that this has happened, so they have a track record that you could probably talk to their accountants. Is that correct?
I don't know the number. I would tend to say, at least in our experience, it's been very limited on this privatized approach. Tom, I don't know whether you've got...
The only transaction I'm aware of was one done in 2012 involving Hope County. And that transaction had some different tax aspects to this one. I think the tax deal was more favorable. To my knowledge, I think this has been talked about a lot, but I'm not aware of anybody actually doing what's proposed here.
Oh, so will we be blazing a new trail, I guess? Okay, thank you. That's my question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Doherty, while you're there, let me follow up on that. Because in my examination of the Hoke County situation, there was some unique situation there in that Hoke County had limitations on their borrowing ability. And therefore, this was a viable alternative to seek out a straight lease payment versus actually borrowing those dollars. Can you expand on that a bit?
I was not involved in the Hope County transaction, so what I know is limited. This deal, one of the reasons why they're proposing to do it the way they're proposing is the way there are some federal income tax credits involved. In Hope County, there was a different set of federal tax credits, which my understanding is they're much more generous than what's involved here. Also, Hope County took advantage of a federal program that was around during the time of the stimulus bill that basically permitted you to borrow interest-free. You could issue your bonds, the federal government would subsidize the interest payments. Here, we're not talking about that. So there was, the Hope County transaction, I know there was more favorable tax treatment at the outset than what we're talking about here.
Well, I just want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples here, and we're not, because
Yep.
there was a totally different structure there for the financing than there is currently under this program.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. King?
I didn't mean I wasn't implying to that. I was implying to the unwind factor here that he's talking about, and how to get out of a lease transaction and to unwind it after a 7-year period, which we may not be here, and to leave something uncharted for another board to get into 7 years out. I was just hoping that the firm had some background talking to other firms and how to use this unwind method. That's what I was implying to blazing new trails. I was just hoping that your firm had used this unwind method so we could get some kind of thought process moving forward, and we didn't leave someone to inherit something that we had no idea what we were doing when we pulled the trigger. That's all I was implying.
In the current draft of the lease that has been proposed, to unwind, you would have to pay the greater of the fair market value of the property or the amount of debt they still owe on the money they borrowed to build the school.
Thank you.
Could I hear that one more time?
Under the draft of the lease that has been proposed, for the county or for the school board and the county to take over the property, they would have to pay the greater of the fair market value of the property or the amount of the debt that has been borrowed by the private corporation to build the school.
Are we
Not the
speaking
lesser, I
of
said
the
greater.
balance of that debt?
Yes, sir.
Then, the then outstanding
The then
amount.
outstanding.
Right, yep.
Can I ask a question?
Mr. Payne?
And the reason and my understanding from talking with their counsel is that they have to be the owner of the property for federal tax purposes, which means that they cannot permit a bargain for consideration at some later point. So they can only promise to sell it to you at fair market value, and what they're saying is the lesser of fair market value or the amount of debt that's owed.
Greater of.
Yeah, I want to say lesser.
I'm just taking advantage of what I had you here. This may be going too far too. Worst case scenario, the private company goes bankrupt. What happens then? I mean, we have to pay up, we're gonna keep the school, we got to pay whatever debt they had. If they're behind.
What I would say is that if the county and the school board decide to proceed with this, we would need to spend a lot of time on questions like that, on questions like what if the school's not completed on schedule, what if it's not built in accordance with the plans and specifications and so forth. It's a very complicated transaction.
It sounds like
Yes.
it. Thank you.
Man,
Would it be reasonable to conclude that this situation over in Hope County might have been and could be an advantage to a county that may have not the best of financial positions? Could that be one of the cases that this will be used?
I think between, as Tom has alluded, between the additional tax credits that were available and these stimulus-related bonds that they issue, it's just a very different set of circumstances. Created an opportunity to fund this school that looked very attractive compared to, let's say, their more traditional options. What their ability might have been to go out to the market and borrow money in their own name, they've got credit, they're able to do that. At what interest rate, I don't know, but they went through some process to determine that if there are risks associated with the financing that they did, they were comfortable that they had benefits that outweighed that.
As a follow-up, Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
sir. This unwinding that we're talking about of the lease, so it's possible that if you want to unwind this lease in 5 to 7 years, for example, that fair market value could be almost as much as it was when you built the school. It could, okay? So you could run into a situation where you may have paid 5 to 7 years worth of leases and still owe almost the full amount of the school, depending on how the person that you're leasing from has got their financing. If they borrow the money themselves, it depends on how they're financing. Because this, what was the other part of that, unwinding?
Or the amount of the debt that they owe, but they're servicing their debt from your lease payment.
Right. You hope.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Well, under the documents they show me, they would take the lease payment the county would pay.
Yeah.
And pledge
This
that
cost
to
is in
pay
here?
that service on their
I
bonds.
don't know whether it was for the same student population or capacity, but it was, my understanding was a high-performance school, but I don't know if it was of same size or scope.
Now, you're teaching us the concept of what can happen. This concept the school system could take this concept and decide on a school that could ultimately cost less than this or more than this based upon what they finally decided they wanted to have. But you could just take this concept and do it. I mean, all the high performance, privatized up, whatever, and just move all that aside and put a certain school in there. Use the concept. So if the school system wanted to stay with the concept of all these entanglements or whatever we're going to call them, they could just say, okay, this is the school we want. We know it's in it. I mean, they could. I'm not suggesting anything, but they could either enhance it or reduce it in size, scope, number of students they had, number of auditoriums or whatever they might decide. But they could use this concept and just.
I believe that's correct. Yes, sir. I mean, they could choose to do it through that privatized approach. I think I believe with
So if the board members who, I think they've gone and looked at, and they had a great feel about the solar and all that and how much energy it could save and so forth and so on. That's what I want to get at. That you're teaching us the concept of what could happen versus the end result. So they could take that and sort of slide what might be practical or reasonable or able into this concept.
I believe that's true. You can choose, I think, to do certain elements of that high performance or not. And the other important thing is the high performance concept is not directly linked to the privatized approach. It's not an all or nothing. You can do the high performance school or some form of it, but do it on a more traditional delivery method.
And the reason I bring that out is at some point in time, school people may see this presentation, and I would just want it to be open that they understood that we're learning the concept, but the final piece, as Mr. Bell sort of alluded to earlier on, is up to them, and they could take a smaller version of these things or an affordable version of these things based upon what we finally get to and go forward.
Yes.
That's all I wanted.
Mr. Doherty.
Kick in there.
All right, I know I'm jumping in here, but I've got to get it in my mind here. I got to have a comparison. On one hand, we see their projections here. I have to look at it from an affordability factor. we have many needs here in our county. So we have to look at affordability. Now, I need a comparison, and the comparison that I'm asking you to give me is if we can borrow money on a certificate of participation at 4%, and I can build schools according to this plan here, I can build a school for $1.5 million, $15 million. I'm up from the other estimate. So $30 million for the two, and I borrow the entire $30 million. If I borrow the full $30 million at 4% over 20 years, what are my payments?
I can work on that. Wow.
Will you work on that? Because that is the comparison in my mind. If I build a traditional school, middle school, that we've already got estimates here of less than $15 million, but I'm gonna round it up to 15, so I can build two schools, same school, two middle schools, $30 million, I borrow it 4% certificate of participation, no bond, then what are my payments? And I think you're going to find that my payments are going to be less than $3 million. In fact, I think the numbers I had were $2.7 million. Now, if I can do that for $2.7 million under a traditional type of financing, then that means that the difference of their $4.7 million is $2 million difference. The $2 million difference, now I'm getting numbers from the school board. They told me that the average cost of utilities was $225,000 to $250,000 a year for utilities. It does not wash because I'm only, for a $2 million payment, I'm saving $250,000. That's a no-brainer, people. That's a no-brainer. I'm not going to spend $2 million a year to save $250,000. How much did I save? I didn't save anything. What I saved was an additional $1.75 million. Now, I'm sorry if I jumped ahead of myself, but I've read all of this. I've studied this. Guess what? One of my neighbors is down the street, and so he's involved me into this whole Spring Creek Elementary thing in the process. So I have studied this a great deal, and I'm just saying it does not make sense. What the school board is asking us to do is to spend $4.6 million of valuable dollars for schools on 2 schools when we have 4 schools that we need. So we are going to have to limit what we can in fact afford. So I think that is, to me, it's a simple approach, I'm sorry, but that's the way I look at it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
One thing I forgot to ask, in North Carolina, the high-performance schools, do you happen to know how many high-performance schools besides the one in Hope County? Do you know of any in North Carolina?
I don't, but I would not necessarily.
Does anyone here know?
It's the only one that they've done.
That's the only one that I'm directly familiar with. Now, we'll say there's probably lots of public buildings that have been built over the years that have some are more high performance than others and have these LEED certifications. So I think on the high performance, I don't think it's yes, it's high performance or no, it's not. There's probably lots of places in between in terms of what you can do to build an energy efficient facility.
But according to what we're looking at here.
Under that term,
okay,
Hoke is the only one that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, there are some initiatives around the state of people using their public buildings for putting things like solar panels.
Right.
Although there's quite a bit of that going on. Not necessarily involving the privatization of financing and things like that, but that is going on.
Well, it just seems to me, if that's the case, they should send a message to us as commissioners and the county that maybe this is not a proven concept yet in this full condition of high performance that falls under that. Because look what we've done. We've had experiences already on our county on other projects that we were first in line and we ended up losing money on the deal because we acted too quickly or had something that wasn't tested. I'm thinking from what I'm seeing, how come people aren't lined up to have these schools built? It's a simple question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I guess I'm gonna ask the question to the rest of the board instead of just to y'all. Do we know whether our school board is even still looking at this concept or not?
Can I answer that?
Yes, sir.
They not only are looking at it, this is their recommendation. Their recommendation is this. Am I correct? This is their recommendation, that in fact, the last letter that I got was that they wanted to go with this, wanted authorization from this board, and that we needed to put in approximately $800,000 a year to make the lease payments. Am I correct? You showed me that email short last night.
Yeah, here's that.
This is their plan, to build these two schools with this paper.
I haven't seen anything on that. I haven't seen anything on that.
Yeah, you just had that email.
I just showed it to you.
No, you didn't show me.
Yeah, right here. There you go.
January 13th?
This is what came in from the chairman. And this came to us in December, into December.
Yeah.
And I'll read this to you. County of Wayne would need to make the commitment of the 20-year lease on which $3,135,250 would be paid from school funds and $782,000 would be paid from county funds on an annual basis. I round up, around $800,000 would be our participation of paying on this lease payment for 20 years.
What page are you reading from?
This was an attachment to an email that you got from John Grantham back in December.
But
It was in December.
That's
I
correct.
beg your pardon?
this one was in January.
January 13th.
It talks about a different figure, doesn't it? So that's not the last one.
Well, I don't think it changed though, did it?
Took the auditoriums out, I think, on the second, on the one that you're talking about, Mr. Cromartie.
Sir,
Didn't they take the auditoriums out on the
they
one
took the
you're talking
auditorium out of this one.
Okay, this one we have has the auditoriums in it.
This one. And I just read a paragraph in it. In a memo to the Board of Commissioners dated December 19, 2013, it was indicated to you that the present design of both new middle schools at Grantham and Spring Creek, the Board of Education will need approximately $782,000 annually for the Board of Commissioners to fully make the payment on both schools. Because of some discussion with regard to auditorium being part of the design, we have calculated the payment without the auditoriums, which would, in effect, reduce our request for the additional system from $782 to $492. The Board of Education and the community involved would prefer to have an auditorium, but if funds cannot be made available, the auditoriums should not prevent moving forward on the construction. So, as the attorney said, this January 13th, 2014 letter is talking about removing the auditoriums.
And Mr. Chair, I'd like to comment on that.
Question?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, on the auditoriums, the 15 million that you used, Mr. Daugherty, earlier, was that in reference to a gymatoriums?
That is
That has
correct. That is correct. That was this was just an idea that, and we got a lot of flack from this, but it's good to have.
Auditorium, I was just thinking.
But this was a gymatorium.
Gymatorium.
Is what they, or something along that line. But back, Mr. Chairman, if I could, falling back on that comment, so from December to January, the school board modified their request by taking the auditoriums out and reducing our payments by roughly $200,000. Well, for $200,000, I'd let them have a gym, but I think that's playing with the figures, guys. You know good and well that an auditorium's gonna cost more than $200,000.
Well,
But roughly, still we would have to contribute roughly $500,000 on an annualized basis to pay for their lease payment.
$300,000.
Right?
5, 6, 7.
How much was that?
300. 5, 6, 7. That's 300,000.
How much?
300,000, not 200,000.
Yeah, but what was the amount that they were saying that we needed?
782 down to 492.
492, which is close to 500. So $500,000 a year that we would have to pay on the lease payment. Oh, for 20 years.
Mr. Chairman. Yes, sir. Now that we all have this, because I just briefly saw it a few minutes ago, but there's two areas that, when this came out, that we have, okay. I remember this now, when it came out, Mr. Chairman and fellow commissioners, we had talked about ADM funds being in jeopardy and the lottery funds in jeopardy, and this particular example shows that there's a 1/2 cent and of 78 million. It also has a lottery here, the 300,000 times 20 years. I think that's a little far-fetched or way out there, because we're really not knowing what lotteries are going to do, and the ADM funds have been taken away. So revenue sources are unbalanced right now, and in particular with sales tax receipts in the county. I'm just looking at the revenue stream. I don't mean to get off course, but everyone's talking about the expense going in. I was thinking about how we're going to pay for it.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Mayor.
am I also reading this correctly, that, and I think I am, the total payments figure of 78,344,000 and some change, even after the 20 years, and we pay that much, there's still a balance of 23 million left. So does that mean that the total payments on these two schools for 20 years would be $101 million, the total payback over 20 years? That's the way I'm seeing it.
That's reasonable.
You're fascinated by that too, aren't you? I know. It took me a long time to figure that one out.
Whose figures are
Bell.
these? Where do these figures come from?
These,
The balance.
They're from the school system.
these figures come from the school board, correct?
Yeah,
Yes.
but,
Came
I
from
mean,
Chairman Grantham.
but where are they in their process? Are they just sit down themselves and just figure this out, or did they?
I suppose so. All I know is we got it in an email.
Did they?
No, this came in
this came in
December, and
December.
that came in January. That was
This
the letter from
was in
January.
December,
This
and
is
then your
December.
letter was in January.
Got a question, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. King.
Being that we have Davenport here and the Carlisle Company, I would like to ask them, the professional,
They're using the same figures.
I think so.
Can't be.
your, as we are right now in February, lottery funds, and now not having the ADM funds. We had Kara Belanzi with University of North Carolina School of Government speak to us a couple weeks ago, did an outstanding job, and brought up the fact that, the lottery funds and the ADM funds. So can you help me understand maybe why they would have put lottery here at 20 years at $6 million?
I can help with that.
Yeah.
It's their annual lottery, current annual lottery amount that they're given each year, less the amount of the principal payment that they have dedicated to the QSCAP, the current QSCAP money, principal that they're paying. The total amount, they're saying that of the total amount they get, which is around 1.3 million, they dedicated $1,071,000 of it to the QSCAP debt service payments. And so there's $300,000 of it they could use up until the QSCAPs are paid off. So they're saying they could use the $300,000 for 20 years. Then they go back down there where you see the $7.499 million. That's after the QSCAPs are paid off. They're saying they'll have 7 years of the $1,071,000 that they can use. So they're using all their lottery funds at the current amount that they're receiving from lottery funds now. That's not taking into consideration where those funds will be available 20 years from now.
That's my, Mr. Chairman, and that's my concern as we have our professionals here today to give us some direction as our money, or the citizens' money going forward. All this is speculative now because of the rules of the game are changing in Raleigh and federal government. And even we were told 2 weeks ago that the lottery issues are being changed, the percentages. I think it was a 40% build are into the capital funding of school buildings, and the part of that lottery is being adjusted. And when we look at these numbers, I have heard from presentations of what it's going to cost going in, but now paying for it going out, I'm really concerned that this is unbalanced in reference to what the rules are in the game today of finance. I think it's unbalanced. There's a lot of speculation here. We know what the real cost is going in, design build, or whether or not we get a full price of construction within a year. And we know a rate, but if we depend on lottery funds and sales tax receipts, in particular lottery funds here, that's indicating $6 million for 20 years out. I think it's unrealistic. But then again, you're the professional, so I'm asking you.
Well, and when we did the QSCAB bond issue 4 years ago, part of that plan for repayment was, yes, there are lottery fund monies, and those can be used to repay those QSCABs. But the reality is, if that lottery money declines, goes away entirely, it's still a debt obligation of the county you're going to have to replace those funds from some other source of fund. And so when you're getting out and projecting those revenues 5, 10, 15, 20 years, there's certainly an element of risk that those funds go away or vary. And then perhaps you're also exposed to some legislative changes that you certainly don't control as to how those funds are distributed at the state level.
And just to finish up, is with Commissioner saying that, we can do 20 years at 4% and a certain amount of money, and you know what you've got. It's the same way with revenue sources. You got to know what you're going to have coming in. And this is really speculative right here, these figures that are provided, in my opinion.
Could I piggyback on that, because that even brings more concern in my mind, and that is that we've already allocated out of the $1.3 million, $1 million of lottery funds for the next,
I think it's about
12 years are in fact going to pay for those schools, that school construction. And if those lottery funds don't come in, guys, we're going to have to come up to the plate and fulfill that gap. And they are just assuming here, which in my mind is a big assumption based upon the climate in Raleigh, that you are assuming that you're going to get $1.3 million for the next 20 years. And I just think that's a bad assumption. I'm sorry, I'm a simple guy. Just, let's get the simplest plan that we can get so that we can afford it. Rather than trying to extend ourselves out 20 we're making, I think, too large of an exposure here, going under a lease of almost $5 million on 2 schools. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Payne.
and I'm trying to remember back, and maybe some of the fellow chairman can help me with this. It seems to be at some point in time, we were talking about $20 million a school going in, and I may be wrong about that. I may have dreamed. I don't have it with me. You have it with you.
I do.
Okay. And all of a sudden now we've come up to $50 million a school. And I don't understand the difference. Now, I think we all agree that we need schools. There's no question about that. Both Grantham, both Spring Creek, and there's some other needs. We agree to where they are and that we need them. But it's just like me, my wife, I'd like to have 2 Mercedes, but we had to buy 2 Chevrolets. Because that's what we could afford, or you could either buy one or another. I think we got to step back and make a determination on how much money we can afford. And I think this is just way out of line. I mean, I've got sticker shock. I don't know about the rest of the commissioners, but I do. And I just had to put that out there. I know that started. While you guys are here today, you've done a fine job explaining how we could, this money is laid out for their concept that they have for this. But we got to step back take a look at what money we got in our pocket. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Mayor?
When you look at the high-performance school versus the traditional school, I think we learned something as a county when we did the Stillmore Library and we did design build. It's been a great experience for us so far. We saved from the original concept over $1 million. Is that correct, Mr. Doder?
I mean, I'm proud of that.
Yes, and so what I'm saying is that, in my opinion, if we were to take a look at a traditional school, and we were to look at design build, that, in my opinion, based on our experience with the Stillmore Library, we could build a traditional school and add some of the green that we want to add as we go along. And my opinion is, if there was a study done on it, we could build that traditional school with some green cheaper than we can build any of these schools that are here, and also have the gymatorial with it. Somebody needs to look at traditional schools, and let's look at adding the green ourselves as we go. That's just a suggestion. That's what we learned from the Still Memorial Library project. So why wouldn't it work for the schools? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I take it you're about finished up?
Yeah, I'll add, I met with the first floor people who were generous with me with their time. Mr. Parker asked me to meet with them and try to get an understanding of what it was they were proposing, answer some of the questions I had in my mind. I do not have now a good understanding on why, if you do this through the privatization, it can be done right away. If you went through a traditional method, it will take a year. I don't have, I'll be happy to visit with that again. I heard the question asked today, and I don't have a good understanding on that.
Question. First floor, you said you've talked to them.
Yes, sir.
Where are they out of?
I believe the gentleman who is the head of the company is out around the Fayetteville area, and he has designed a lot of schools in North Carolina. I'm aware of that.
I believe they have an office in Winston-Salem as well.
Well,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I'm thinking. No, you go ahead and ask George, but I'm thinking.
I got a long statement I want to read here. As you realize, patience is not one of my virtues. It just isn't. You know, I see a challenge and I want to solve it. Folks, we have talked for a year about these two schools. We got a lot of criticism by going out here and actually getting an alternative plan. Actually going on and visiting a school similar to what our plan was. And our plan, and here it was right here, just a suggestion. Now that was taken out of context that we wanted to take over building the schools. We were just giving a suggestions here. But this was a prominent architect that has been used by the school board that designed these schools, and their cost on this estimate was $12,609,000 to build a school. And that school would have a gymatorium to it. Now, with that in mind, we evidently have already got estimates of $15 million or less, so that would mean if we're going to build 2 middle schools, that we ought to be able to get it for $30 million. Our capital improvement plan said $30 million. So I'm finding a hard time here. The families of Wayne County are really frustrated because we've been going round and around and around on this thing. The school board wants to accuse us of getting into their business, and we're not trying to do that. We're just trying to find some common ground here. But let's talk about what the two boards do agree on.